Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story, where Debbie Whitechapel has just met her mother-in-law, and she was very apprehensive about doing so because she thought her mother-in-law was likely a very intimidating woman. So let's find out what's about to happen next, and let's continue with part 3 of our story. Debbie's account. When I first laid eyes on Carol Huberger, my future mother-in-law that is, my heart sank like a stone being flung into a deep body of water. I felt incredibly intimidated by Carol when I first met her. She looked so incredibly upper crust and well-to-do, far too upmarket and classy to associate with the likes of me. She really was the doppelganger for a younger Shirley MacLaine. Now I was nervous. My future mother-in-law was really posh. I had originated from very humble proletarian roots with 2 working-class parents who had struggled to send me and my siblings to college. They had worked 4 jobs between the 2 of them. I was not sure I would meet up to Carol's genteel, exacting expectations. If she thought I lacked polish and was unsophisticated in my ditzy sundress, she certainly didn't register any disapproval in her eyes, which I was extremely grateful for. At least she was polite and didn't appear to look down on me condescendingly. Instead, she greeted me formally with a handshake and led us into their lovely upmarket home. Lathan told me that Carol was a tad untidy. My foot! There was nothing remotely out of place in this house. It was so clean and incredibly meticulous you could have eaten your food off the polished walnut floors. There were flowers distributed everywhere very generously throughout the house, and the house smelt exquisite of both lemongrass, neroli and rose. Our bedroom was sumptuously presented, like a suite in a grand hotel, with indulgent ritzy toiletries, luxurious bed linen, and fluffy towels, and even chocolates on the pillowcases, so that we were made to feel terribly welcome. The dining room, with its wood-panelled walls and complimentary vintage red colour scheme, seemed to have been set to prepare for royalty itself. The long walnut table was covered with a starched linen white tablecloth, and there were extravagant displays of fragrant red and pink roses lining the centre of the table, along with a silver candelabra filled with red candles that were all set alight, so that when I sat down to enjoy the family meal, I felt rather like a fish out of water, but in no time at all, Carol made me feel remarkably relaxed. "So tell me, Debbie, all about yourself. I'm intrigued to know all about you. How exactly did you meet my son?" she asked. She handed me a delicious fluffy bowl of mashed potatoes. The food we were eating for lunch was absolutely superb. It was my all-time favourite food. Lamb shanks, melt in the mouth they were, done in a red wine gravy. The meat was so tender and juicy, it just fell off the bone. There was no doubt that Carol was an extremely impressive woman. She was without doubt a killer cook, so I was enjoying the meal, and the expensive, rather heady red wine she served seemed to calm me down significantly, so I was able to abandon my inhibitions. I was silent for a brief moment, as I awkwardly stumbled on my words. Should I tell Carol how we met, I wondered. It was a tad embarrassing. "Well, it's not pretty, I'm afraid," I told her nervously. "I don't know if there's any polite way to say this, but the day I met your son, I was very, very drunk." "You don't need to go into all of that," Lathan told me, but I continued to tell Mrs. Huberger our story. "Well, just so you know, Mrs. Huberger, I'm not a drinker. I don't even particularly like alcohol all that much. But one of the people at work was leaving to go abroad. He was moving to Ireland, you see. We threw a big farewell party for him at the bar in town, and some of my well-meaning work colleagues ploughed me with an excess of alcohol. You know what people can be like. I don't know why I agreed to drink so much. I'd never behaved like that before. I should have had my wits about me. It's embarrassing when I look back on it all. Everything about that party was blurry and ambiguously vague, as if I'm looking through the mist on the bathroom mirror, I'm ashamed to say. I don't remember it very much. I'm usually prudent about how much I drink, but this time I drank more than I've ever drank before. But I guess I learnt a salient lesson. Never again, never. I certainly don't like the feeling of being so drunk.
Well, I can understand that, my dear. I've been drunk before myself, and I can't stand the feeling of not feeling as if my feet aren't firmly on the ground, if you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean. It was like that for me. I was very lucky because my sober friend Felicity called me an Uber taxi on my behalf, charging it to her own account. She's a very generous girl. She gave the driver my address. I remember her saying to me, "My God, you're drunk, Debbie. How much have you had to drink tonight? You're completely legless." "I'm not drunk," I told her, slurring my words and giggling a lot. When I got into the taxi, I really was giggling like a teenager, Mrs. Huberger, hooting with laughter at absolutely everything. I seemed to find everything hilariously funny, including that dangly thing on the dashboard mirror, which I think was an air freshener. I don't know why, but I found it so funny. I don't think the Uber driver was remotely impressed by my behaviour. He warned me that if I attempted to get sick in his car, he'd throw me out of his cab in a heartbeat and charge me for all the cleaning costs. I remember he kept watching me vigilantly through the visor mirror. He was very suspicious. I don't think he trusted me not to throw up over his entire car. I did feel a bit nauseous, but I giggled the entire way home. As I said, I found everything crazily funny.
What's wrong with you people? Why can't you youngsters stop at just a couple of drinks? In my day, we knew how to control ourselves. Why do you have to drink a whole damn brewery? What's the fun in that?"
The driver mumbled. Even though I was drunk, I do remember his words. He was not remotely happy to have picked me up. When I got to the apartment block where I live, the driver got out of his Uber in the parking lot, opened the door for me, practically dragging me out of the vehicle, as if he couldn't get rid of me fast enough. I suppose I can't really blame him for that. I was such a sorry, wretched sight, Mrs. Huberger. I'm so embarrassed just even thinking about it. The poor Uber driver. Well, he wore an expression of revulsion on his face. I'm sure I stank of alcohol, and I was staggering all over the place.
Don't be so hard on yourself, dear. We've all had our moments when we haven't been at our best. But it's a forgivable offence. At least you got an Uber home. You didn't drive on your own, and that's highly commendable.
Well, thanks for saying that. It's very kind of you to say that, Mrs. Huberger. But anyway, I swaggered rather awkwardly to the lift. I took it up to the 3rd floor and discovered to my horror when I got to my apartment that I'd actually left my purse containing my mobile phone in the back of the taxi. In truth, I think it had slipped under the seat, if I remember correctly, so the driver himself would not have seen it. He had long since left. So I was locked out of my apartment, and I was so disorientated and so wobbly on my feet that I couldn't think clearly. So the only thing I could do, Mrs. Huberger, was to bang on your son's door. He was my immediate next-door neighbour, you see. Well, I made such a huge fool of myself, but your son, Mrs. Huberger, was so kind to me. I practically passed out on his front doorstep, but he brought me into his flat, gathering me back to my feet.
Well, please don't call me Mrs. Huberger, love. My friends call me Carol, and I would like it very much if you did too. And you know, I do expect my son to be kind to people when they've got themselves in a rough place, so I'm very glad he was able to help you in the circumstances.
Well, he did more than help me. Your son was so kind, Mrs. Huberger. Of course, I think he was shocked by my drunken state, but he recognised me as being his next-door neighbour. I mean, we'd seen each other in passing in the lobby. He told me I was in no state to do anything about my purse until the morning. He gave me a bed for the night, which was so kind of him. He slept on the couch. In the morning, when I woke up in my next-door neighbour's apartment, which was your son, of course, I couldn't understand what I was doing there, until I remembered my drunken behaviour from the previous night. Oh, I felt so ashamed, Mrs. Huberger.
Of course you did. That was only natural. But as I keep saying, don't be so hard on yourself. I've done it before, myself. Woken up on a friend's couch, legless as they come. So we've all been there at some point in time.
Well, as I was saying, your son was incredibly kind, sympathetic towards me. He told me as long as I was all right, that was all that matters, but that he thought I should probably not drink again, since I didn't really, take alcohol very well. Lathan went off to the bakery on my account to get croissants for us and coffee for breakfast. He then contacted the taxi for me and paid for them to send the driver out to drop off my purse. I mean, can you believe he did all that for me?
Well, I can believe it, dear. My Latham is a very good boy.
I decided from that moment on, Mrs. Huberger, that your son was a keeper. I was determined to get to know him better. So I kept inviting myself over to his apartment for a chat and a cup of coffee, because I knew he'd never do that to me. He'd never take the initiative to ask me out. Your son, well, he's the reticent type, isn't he? I knew he would never, ever do the chasing. He was far too shy for that. So I realised the ball was in my court. I'd never been that assertive before, nor have I ever chased a boy. But this time I knew if I wanted Lathan, I'd have to be the one in the driving seat. I knew I'd struck gold meeting your son, Mrs. Huberger. I knew a good thing when I saw it. So I pursued the relationship, rather like a bat out of hell. I mean, Mrs. Huberger, it took forever for your son to get the message that I actually liked him in a special way. Finally, I was so exasperated, I just said to him, Lathan, I've got strong feelings for you. I'd really like to date you. And you know what he said, Carol?
No, what did he say?
She asked. He just said, that's fine. Carol chuckled.
That is so typical of Lathan. Talk about being vague. I mean, what does fine actually mean?
That's exactly what I thought. I wasn't sure what it meant either. I actually said to him, what do you mean by fine, Lathan? And he said,
it'll be a pleasure to date you, Debbie.
Well, that was that. We fell for each other. Very hard, actually. Your son then asked me to marry him about 2 weeks ago. I could hardly believe it, Mrs. Huberger. I didn't hesitate to say yes. Lathan is the very best thing that has ever happened to me. And it's like it was just meant to be. I know the drunken side of our love story is not particularly romantic, Mrs. Huberger, but it was the way that me and your son met. And then afterwards things between us blossomed. And now here I am, can you believe it, sitting here over your dinner table, eating the most delicious lamb shank that I've ever tasted in my life. It's sobering to think that had I not taken the initiative, or the bull by the horns, well, I might not be here now.
Well done to you, my dear, for going after what you want and pursuing it with a passion. Highly commendable it is. And you're absolutely right about my Lathan. He's, well, rather like his late father, a chip off the old block, so to speak. Rather reluctant to chase after a pretty girl. His father was much the same, So like you, Debbie, I had to tell my Christopher that I was the girl for him. I had to make all the decisions in that regard. I told him I liked him, and that was that. And we sealed the deal. We got together. I think we got married about a month later. That was how quick it was. Mum, would you stop talking about me and my late father, as if we're marble statues without any emotions of any kind? Sweetheart, you've said it yourself. You know very well you've never been forthcoming. Your father was much the same. What I'm trying to say here Had Debbie not pursued you, you might be alone in your apartment in Houston right now, even as I speak. So it is absolutely wonderful the two of you got together like this. Mom, I just wish you wouldn't go down this road. You're making me feel very uncomfortable. Oh, don't listen to my son, Debbie. He's overreacting. Now don't you dare apologize for getting drunk, dear. We've done it before at some time in our lives. If we say otherwise, we're lying through our teeth. We've been there and got the T-shirt. I'm just very glad that Latham here gave you a bed for the night. It was certainly the right thing for him to do. I think I can call him a chivalrous gentleman. That's how I raised him. My husband was much the same, you know. The quintessential gentleman, always opening up car doors for me. Stuff like that. He was a terribly considerate man. When it comes to drink, Debbie, some people just can't handle alcohol. I'm also one of those types. I can't drink much without getting very drunk. It sounds like you overdid it on that night. Now, what I want to know, I want to get the nuts and the bolts of this conversation. What is it, Debbie, that you like most about my son? What do you find very attractive about him? Mum, must you ask Debbie these questions? You're embarrassing me. Debbie, you don't have to answer my mother if you don't want to.
I flushed as red as a field of poppies and let out an awkward giggle. Relax, Lathan. I'm happy to talk to your mother about how we met. Well, what is there not to like about Lathan? He's the whole package, isn't he? I like the fact, Carol, that Lathan is so reserved. I've always been attracted to men who are more self-effacing. Maybe because I'm the reverse. So we kind of complement each other. I'm more creative, artistic, gregarious and outgoing. Lathan is prudent, judicious, mathematical, quiet and unassuming. So it works for the both of us. His strengths are my weaknesses and vice versa. The last thing I'd ever want is to be with someone that was exactly like me. I couldn't think of anything worse.
I know exactly what you mean, my dear. That makes perfect sense to me. Lathan's father was much the same, you know. A very contained man he was. But I always knew what he was thinking, even though he was a man of very few words. So tell me, dear, when are the two of you getting married?
Well, we're thinking of doing something in a year's time, aren't we, Lathan? But we want to make the wedding small. You know, just a few people. We were thinking of a private beach wedding in Hawaii. Something like that.
That sounds perfectly lovely, dear.
It was after a very enjoyable lunch spent with Carol Huberger that me and my fiancé Lathan began to bring out the suitcases that were packed in the back of the hire car. And that was when I noticed him for the very first time. The old man from the house opposite, standing in his front yard, staring right at us blankly, almost as if looking through a glass pane. But his expression was just so vacant, as if he wasn't all in there. "Who's that man?" I asked Lathan. "He keeps staring at me, but it's like he's looking right through me. It's creeping me out, Lathan, it really is. He almost looks like a ghost."
"Oh, that's Mr. Clayton Harrington," said Lathan, smiling warmly. "He's a very quiet person, keeps himself to himself, although he's known to be a little prickly at times. When I was a kid, we would call him the porcupine, because you handled him with care, if you get my drift. His house is right next to the hiking trail I was telling you all about. If you see that dirt road on the side of the house, and all the trees at the back of the property, they stretch back for many miles into a luxurious, rather sprawling woodland oasis. The locals love to access it. You can do anything. You can take an ATV down there, a horse perhaps, or even a mountain bike. That's the trail you can go on for your morning jog if you like. Mr. Harrington lived in that house for many long years, you know, with his wife. I suppose it's only polite to go and say hello to him, now that he's seen us. He's probably just naturally curious about you. Maybe that's why he's staring so rudely. But don't be offended by the man. He can be a bit in your face, but he's actually very nice, you know. I'll introduce you to him myself.
Lathan took my hand in his, and together we crossed the street. The old man was standing next to a purple buddleia bush in his front yard, where butterflies and bees were pollinating the purple blooms industriously. He was staring into the ether, with a vacant expression on his heavily wrinkled face. He barely acknowledged us as we made our approach. My first thought was there was something wrong with him, for he was like a dead man standing, and his vacuous expression continued to give me the creeps.
"Hello, Mr. Harrington. It's very good to see you,"
said Lathan, stretching out his hand to shake the old man's.
"Long time no see. I've been away for a while, you see, but I hope you haven't forgotten about me," he joked. "I'm sure my mother told you I'm living in Houston these days, so I'm a little far away from home."
The old man turned around and looked straight at Lathan with a haunted look on his face. It was as if he was caught up in a world of his own. I felt almost tempted to wave a hand in front of his face and say, "Hello, is anybody in there?"
"It's me, Lathan Huberger, Carol's son. Don't you remember? Or have I changed so terribly much? I must admit I've been away for a while. But I'd like to introduce you to my fiancée. This is Debbie Whitechapel. We're here visiting my mother, all the way from Houston."
I gave the man a watery, rather insincere smile, hoping in vain he might acknowledge me. But I wasn't holding out much confidence. The man's face was so white, his complexion pallid, his eyes almost looked like hollow sockets, his whole body pretty crooked. He seemed rather slumped over. As I expected, Clayton Harrington did not take Lathan's hand in his, nor did he bother to take mine. The moment was incredibly awkward. All of a sudden Clayton Harrington's eyes grew round, and suddenly the old man grabbed Lathan's arm and said,
"I've seen him. He's very big. You must watch out. Very, very big feet. Big feet. He was watching me, you know. He followed me home. I told you, he's big. I knew what he was when I saw the feet. He's very clever, you know. Far too clever. He can see right through you. You've got to watch out. You must watch out. He knows things. He sees what we can't see."
He shook his head and trotted back into his house, leaving both me and Lathan completely confounded. We gawped at each other in astonishment, and both shook our heads.
"What the hell was that about?"
Lathan asked me. "Maybe he's losing his marbles," I suggested. "It didn't seem he was all there, did he? Has he got a touch of dementia, perhaps? Should he be living in his house on his own like this?" I asked. "I mean, is he capable of looking after himself? He could be a danger to himself, couldn't he? The kind of person who might leave the oil on in the pot on the hob. Forget about it. You know what I mean? Bringing the whole place down in a pile of smoke."
"It is a troubling thought,"
Lathan admitted, his brow furrowing into worried crinkles.
"I'll need to talk about this with my mother. I'm concerned about the man. If this is the way he's carrying on, he's almost certainly going to need special help. I mean, he barely acknowledged me. In fact, he didn't. He failed to recognize me. And as for you, I don't think he noticed you at all. I understand he refuses to leave the property, but at the very least he needs a full-time carer, doesn't he, on the premises with him, making sure he doesn't do something stupid. You're right. He's certainly caught up in his own world. What was all that about big feet? What was he going on about somebody knowing who we are or something? I've never known him to be like this. He definitely is delusional. But he's getting on in age, and age can be very cruel, can it not?"
When I retired to bed that night, Lathan was grinning at me like a Cheshire cat, a satisfied one.
"My mother definitely likes you a lot, Debbie. I can see it in her eyes. I think she approves of you. And that makes me very happy, you know."
"Oh, I'm so relieved to hear you say that, Lathan. Your mother's so refined, so classy. I was worried I wouldn't measure up for her. I wasn't sure if I should tell her how we met. I thought she might be absolutely appalled, but I was wrong. I mean, she was so kind about the whole thing. She was cool about it, wasn't she?"
"My mother's never been the judgmental type. She liked our story very much, and I think she likes you a lot. I can tell."
I like your mother too. She's terribly posh, isn't she? But she's not remotely condescending, nor does she have a superior attitude. You told me her house was a mess, Lathan. How could you say that? This place is an absolute palace. She's certainly not a hoarder. I don't see any junk lying around anywhere. Everything shines like a brand new pin. I'd struggle to find any dust anywhere. And I suspect if I ran my fingers on top of her doors, I'd not even find a speck of dust there either. The house is perfectly beautiful.
The house was a mess, said Lathan. It really was, you must believe me. I know because I've lived here most of my life. But my guess is that my mother panicked when she knew you were coming to stay here, and busted a gut to get the place looking perfect for you. I suspect she wanted to make a good impression on you. I know when people came around for dinner when I was a boy, my mother would stuff all the mess in a closet so that the house would look immediately presentable. She always worried about what other people might think. I don't know why she cared so much, but that's my mother for you. Very particular she is.
That makes me feel so much better, Lathan. Your mother is not perfect then, and that means that to me she is more relatable than ever. But I wish she hadn't felt the need to clean up on my account. I don't mind a bit of mess at all, nor do I care about clutter. I'm used to it all growing up in a large, sizable family. I was around organised chaos all the time. As my fiancé climbed into the luxurious brand new linen sheets of the bed, with me by his side, he said,
"Oh, I'm bushed. Exhausted. That flight took a lot out of me, you know. I don't care if the flight wasn't all that long. It's still insufferable sitting up there in an aeroplane. Can you imagine if we'd driven here for all those hours? I couldn't do it myself. Personally, I feel as if I could sleep for a week. How are you feeling?"
"Tired," I admitted. "Really tired. But I'm heartily relieved to have finally met your mother. At least the anxiety has finally left me."
"Good, I'm glad to hear that, sweetheart. I told you it was a storm in a teacup. You had nothing to worry about. And my mother likes you. You do look infinitely more relaxed, but I can see you're very tired."
Before he switched off his bedside lamp, he asked me if I was going to take a jog in the morning. "Too right I am. It's the path we saw next to the old man's house, right?"
"That's right. You'll find the key to the front door hanging on the hook in the hall. So you can let yourself out very discreetly. Try not to make a noise. Unfortunately, my mother happens to be a very light sleeper. The floorboards and the landing always creak. Also, that Maltese poodle of hers, I'm afraid, is quite the yakker. So if he hears you scurrying around, he might make an awful commotion. And when he starts yakking, he doesn't stop. You know what some small dogs can be like."
The following morning, I woke up with quite a start. My surroundings were so unfamiliar to me. I wondered where I was. I felt a tad confused and disorientated, until I remembered I was in Carol Huberger's house. It was dark outside, with a tiny speck of morning light, stretching its way impertinently across the dark sky, like a long ribbon. I observed it sneaking through an open crack in the curtain that allowed a smidgen of this illumination to infuse the spare room, so that even the furniture became less ambiguous, and I could see my way around clearly. I was used to getting up early. My body seemed to be reprogrammed to this early morning rise. I grabbed my cell phone hurriedly from the nightstand to check out the time. It was earlier than I imagined. It was 4:58 in the morning, nearly 5 o'clock. I could hear the rhythmic snores of my fiancé, see the rise and fall of his chest, which affirmed he was still alive. He was such a deep sleeper that even if I made a noise, he'd be unlikely to hear me. I climbed rather cautiously out of my comfortable bed, reluctant to leave its soft coziness. I made my way to the bathroom, brushing my teeth as quickly as I could, and splashing cold water all over my face. I then tied up my shoulder-length brown bobbed hair into a neat ponytail. I put on a pair of purple leggings and a white string t-shirt. It was warm in the bedroom, so I discreetly left the room, treading very carefully on my tiptoes along the landing. Lathan was absolutely right. The floorboards were making an unfortunate, annoying creak under my feet, and every time I moved, as discreetly as I possibly could, I was half expecting to be interrupted by the loud, raucous yakking of Carol's Maltese poodle. I understood that little Herbert slept in her arms every night. Of course, he absolutely adored Carol. Of that there was no doubt. I also knew there was a cat lurking around somewhere, but apparently he absolutely hated strangers, so had made himself scarce. Carol admitted I would be unlikely to ever get to meet him, as the male cat mirrored the male residents that had lived in Carol's house. He was extremely aloof. And as for little Herbert, that little Maltese poodle did not trust anyone other than Carol, and when I arrived at her house he had eyed me with much displeasure, as if I had intruded on his private territory. Finally I found the key on the hook, and plunged it into the lock, pulling back the chain from the front door. Once I'd opened the door, I was greeted to the fresh scented air with a light wind that whipped against my cheeks. The sky was now a very light colour. I crossed to the other side of the road, and that was when I noticed that Clayton Harrington's front door was half open. I thought that the absent-minded man had obviously gone to bed, failing to close his door behind him. He seemed to be rather scatterbrained and forgetful. I wasn't worried about him, given he was so absent-minded. I decided when I returned from my jog in the woods, if his door was still open, I would drop in on the man just to check he was all right. This was a safe neighbourhood, with the locals who looked out for each other, and there was zero crime in these parts, so I was pretty certain the old man was fine, just suffering from the affliction of being rather dithery and rather confused. I proceeded eagerly on my way down the footpath. I didn't feel like running this morning, so a brisk walk would do nicely instead. I always listened to my body, and I suspected I was physically worn out and exhausted from the build-up of nervous tension I had subjected myself to over the meeting with my mother-in-law. I smiled to myself, as it had all been a storm in a teacup, and my worries had really mounted to nothing. I realized that Carol Huberger was someone I could grow to easily love, which was a huge relief to me. She might bear a startling resemblance to Shirley MacLaine that I had watched in that overbearing mother-in-law movie, but she was nothing like that woman in the movie, which was a huge relief. Carol Huberger was a lovely lady, and I was warming to her in leaps and bounds. I ran down the footpath that was layered with fallen leaves and twigs from the previous fall. The woodgrove smelt earthy, and there was a lingering minty smell intermingled with some jasmine notes that filtered in the morning air. The birds burst into song, filling the woods with their orchestral trills and warbles to welcome in the new morning. It was all so inspiring. My first thought was that anyone that was tucked up in bed was missing out a great deal. It was so lovely to be up and about this early in the morning. The plants and shrubs in the woodgrove were covered with morning dew, and silvery spider webs draped themselves across branches, glistening like ethereal dream catchers. The trail was generous, shaded heavily by tall, lofty trees, most of them deciduous, with boughs abundant with rich leafy foliage. There were ferns and low-growing shrubs growing abundantly everywhere. I noticed pawpaw trees, maples, silver bells, oaks, and buckeye trees, and there were wild berries growing in abundance. Many had fallen onto the path. I noticed a couple of shy little rabbits further down the path, scuttling away from me, and that was when I saw him. It was the old man, Clayton Harrington. He was standing there just staring into space, and he appeared to be talking to someone.
"I told you, leave me alone. I don't want to go home. I want to stay here with you. I'm perfectly fine. I told you I'm fine. Don't make me go home. I don't want to go home."
I stared in disbelief at the idiosyncratic scene playing out before my eyes, like the most weird movie you've ever watched in your entire life. Clayton Harrington was more than just a little dithery and confused. The man was absolutely delusional. He appeared to be talking to fresh air. He must be completely mad. As I got closer to the bonkers old man, a figure that I believed had been a short, stout tree with burly proportions that I had not been paying attention to, suddenly just moved. It was speaking to Clayton in an authoritative tone of voice, but in a language I didn't understand. His words were earnest and slow, and Clayton Harrington appeared to be hanging on to his every word, but he seemed to be rebelliously reactive towards the figure he was talking to, like an insubordinate, petulant child in the classroom that doesn't want to do what he's told. Mr. Clayton's behaviour was juvenile and almost childlike. I sneaked up gingerly behind a tree to watch and observe everything that was going on. As I got closer and closer, I realised that the tall, lofty figure that had been talking to Clayton Harrington was a Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. The creature, by a tree's standards, was short, but very tall in comparison to an average human being. I believe he could have been 10 foot tall. He was burly and Herculean in his proportions. He was covered in long flowing dark hair, with a face so astonishingly human, it took me aback. Indeed, I hate to say this, but his face rather reminded me of one of the professors at the university I'd attended, a somewhat intimidating man called Sidney Rothercher. But the facial resemblance was uncanny. I just hope he's not listening to this now, because I doubt he would be amused. The creature had a flat nose and very pronounced cheekbones. This is not what I'd expected to see, and for a brief moment it was so surreal for me, I almost wondered if I was dreaming this. I remember my eyes widened, my mouth dropped wide open, and my heart began to thunder in my chest. The Bigfoot was possibly the most terrifying creature I have ever beheld, the kind of being you wouldn't want to stumble across in the dead of night, for you might think the Grim Reaper had come to collect your soul, to take you straight to hell, with no hope of any redemption. I had heard of Bigfoot before, of course I had. In truth, I'd never paid much attention to the subject. I guess I always just assumed that cryptid creatures were just legendary, rather like fairies and the little people, that belonged with folklore, fables, fairy tales and legends. I remember my mother used to believe in such things. She believed that Bigfoot existed, as she believed in the little people. I'm ashamed to say that the rest of my entire family would scoff and ridicule her, teasing her for being so fanciful. My father would say she was a big dreamer, but my mother would always say, "You laugh at what you don't understand, but I assure you these things do exist." My mother's family emigrated to America during the potato famine, so on my mother's side of the family we had a strong Irish lineage. On my father's side, they came from England. My mother had tales from her grandmother about the little people. None of us believed her seemingly fictitious stories, but now, as I was staring at this real live Bigfoot, it was like a locked door in my mind that had been bolted for so many years just flew wide open. I realised that perhaps my mother's stories from Ireland about the little people were not so far-fetched after all. Maybe they were true. I had been a doubting Thomas all my life, driven by extreme scepticism, which I suspect my years at university hadn't exactly helped. I guess I never believed in things I physically couldn't see, but my mother was always quick to point out that just because you cannot see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. My mother's grandmother had lived in Ireland all her life, and had told my mother that when she was a little girl, she was playing dollies with her little sister Amelia out of doors. Both the children had been given china dolls as a gift from their grandparents. My mother said the dolls were dressed up in spectacularly beautiful clothes that my grandmother's mother had made especially for them. By all accounts, she was an excellent seamstress, so my grandmother and her sister were extremely proud of their very smart dolls. They decided to leave their dolls sitting under the shade of a large oak tree in the front yard. They hurriedly ran indoors to get their tea. When they returned to the yard to resume their game of dolls again, they found, to their astonishment, their dolls were completely naked, missing all their clothes. My grandmother automatically assumed that a friend of theirs, who had light fingers and was very jealous of their dolls' pretty dresses, had stolen them on a whim. It was the only thing that made sense to them. Their mother made them more beautiful dresses for their dolls, so they were very happy about that. My grandmother and her sister decided that they would never ever leave the dolls in the yard unattended again. They didn't want any more clothes to be stolen. They kept their dolls safely in their bedroom. One morning they woke up from a good night's sleep, only to observe that their precious dolls were not wearing their usual clothes. Instead, they were dressed in sackcloth. No one could understand what on earth was going on, and who had succeeded at entering their bedroom during the night without being observed, just to steal the pretty dresses, as nothing else in the house was missing. One night my grandmother woke up in the middle of the night to hear a strange scurrying sound in her bedroom. She sat up with a start, discovering to her amazement that her beloved doll was lying naked on the floor, stripped of all her clothes. And that was when she saw two little people standing over her doll, trying to dress it up in a horrible dress made of sackcloth. My grandmother saw that one of the little people was wearing one of the doll's dresses that had gone missing that day when they had left their dolls in the yard. She obviously wanted to acquire another pretty dress for herself, and had removed the dress that my grandmother's doll was wearing. My grandmother watched the little people dress her doll in sackcloth. When they realized she had seen them, they looked at her and giggled mischievously. And they hurriedly scurried away. She never ever saw them again. When she told her mother what had happened, her mother told her she had observed the little people, and now the disappearances of the dolls' dresses made perfect sense to her. My grandmother's mother made the little people outfits to wear, both female and male outfits. She would leave them for the little people, so that they had lovely clothes instead of sackcloth. My grandmother's mother said the little people must be very happy, as they would leave her daisy chains, little handmade woven baskets, and tiny bunches of flowers, and that happened for many years. When I was told the story, of course, I didn't believe a word of it. But now as I stood there staring at this Bigfoot, talking to the old man, I wasn't sure about anything anymore, as my view of reality had been dramatically shifted. The Bigfoot I was observing was definitely all male. I could feel his all-consuming masculine energy, as if the air around me was charged with testosterone. But it wasn't an angry, frustrated energy, more a powerful, commanding, warrior-like energy that demanded respect. What confounded me was he was not remotely aggressive, but seemed to be kind in nature, but firmly spoken towards Clayton Harrington, as if he was not going to take any nonsense from the old man. He had a firm hand on Clayton's back, and was steadily guiding him back through the woodgrove, as if encouraging the old man to go back home. But Clayton Harrington was having none of it. He was behaving like a spoilt, petulant brat that did not want to listen. "But I want to be with you," the old man chortled. "Why can't I come back with you? I don't want to go home. There is no one at my home. I want to be with you." Once again the Bigfoot spoke to the old man in a strange idiosyncratic language. "Mikalina holataka hisapatilana holanikwa hisapala." But the old man seemed to understand what he was saying. The Bigfoot was trying to encourage the old man to walk through the woods and go back home, with a nudge of his hand. But Clayton Harrington resisted. He oscillated his arms around him like an angry octopus. "I told you, I don't want to go. I want to stay here with you." All of a sudden, I snapped a twig under my feet. I held my breath, hoping I had not been heard. But it was too late. The Bigfoot's face shot up. His focus turned towards the tree where I was hiding. My heart sank. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I could almost predict it. The Bigfoot had been nice enough to a rather helpless, harmless old man. But how would the same creature react to me? I was about to find out, and I wasn't looking forward to it one bit. I could hear the heavy, ponderous feet pounding the forest floor like a pestle and mortar. And then there he was, standing only 2 feet away from me, watching me cowering behind the tree like a frightened deer that had been discovered by a hungry coyote and was about to become prey. I could hear his sharp intake of breath as his dark, steely eyes pinned themselves on me. There was a somewhat bewildered expression that came upon his face. I didn't think the Bigfoot had realized that I had been there. He had been taken off guard. I cannot describe to you the feeling of standing only inches away from a strapping, broad-shouldered male Bigfoot with such a powerful shredded body. It would make some of our most hardened bodybuilders look pathetically puny and seem wretchedly frail by contrast. I remember my heart was literally galloping in my chest, almost as if thousands of male stallions were jumping right through me at the speed of light. I was so frightened standing before this Bigfoot, so vulnerable and fragile. I literally wanted the ground to swallow me whole, so that I wouldn't be here. You may ask why I did not run away, but that would have been impossible, as my body had become so rigidly stiff, so unobliging, that I was anchored to the spot, like a ship in its mooring place. It was when the Bigfoot's honey-brown eyes met mine that I was hit with a profound sense of knowing that all was well, and that I was perfectly safe and secure, and nothing bad was going to happen to me. I was flooded in what I can only describe as waves of a warm ocean that washed over me, and my fear just floated away like a balloon on the wind. What happened next was extraordinary, to say the very least, as the Bigfoot spoke to me in his unusual language, and I remember thinking, how was I expected to understand a word of what he was saying? But I need not have worried, for the meaning of his words tumbled into my head, for reasons I could not fathom, but I understood exactly what he was saying. Looking back, I always wondered how that actually happened.
Matikwa, sinatila kinakwa, hodali sakinolo. Anikali solobanasa, hikakwana. I need your help, said the Bigfoot, pointing towards the old man. He's very confused, I'm afraid. He's hovering between the astral and the real world. It happens sometimes before people leave this world. His time is short, I'm afraid. He's soon to go. But at this stage he doesn't understand whether he's coming or going. You see, he's floating between two realms. He's disorientated. He appears to want to come with me. I have tried to take him back to his home, but he refuses to go. He's been like this over the last week or so, but he cannot stay here in the forest on his own. Not in his state of mind. He's far too confused. He wants to come with me, but where I go, he cannot come. Maybe you can talk to him, persuade him to go back home, because I've tried my best to do so, but he's not listening. He's very obstinate, you see.
I nodded. I couldn't believe I was actually talking to a Bigfoot. I told him that I would try my very best to get Clayton Harrington to go home. The Bigfoot nodded at me appreciatively, and I watched him hurriedly gliding through the trees, with Mr. Clayton Harrington trying to stagger after him, like an inebriated drunk.
"Where are you going?" he cried. "Come back! Come back! Don't go!"
But the Bigfoot was long gone. Mr. Harrington! Mr. Harrington! Are you all right?" I asked, grabbing the old man by the arm. He shrugged me away. "I think you need to come with me, Mr. Harrington. You're a little confused. You need to get home. I'll take you there." Mr. Harrington, who had not noticed me, turned around to glare at me.
"Who are you?" he snapped. "I don't know who you are. Leave me alone. Get away from me. I don't want you anywhere near me. Go away."
"Mr. Harrington, I'm afraid you're a little confused. How about I take you back home? You can't possibly stay here in the woodgrove on your own. You might get lost. And your friend, I'm afraid, is long gone. He can't help you now, but I can." The old man retracted his arm furiously.
"Go away! Leave me alone! Haven't you heard a word I've said? I told you I don't want you anywhere near me. I don't know you. I don't know you."
"Mr. Harrington, yes, that's true. You don't know me. I'm Debbie Whitechapel. You remember Lathan Huberger? Well, he's my fiancé. We're getting married, so I'm not really a stranger, hypothetically. I'm Carol's soon-to-be daughter-in-law. You remember Carol Huberger? She lives over the road from you, the house opposite you.
Lathan, the old man repeated. Where is Lathan? I've got a bone to pick with that naughty boy. I told him not to ride his bicycle over my foxgloves in the front yard, but he never would listen. Do you know he broke the window in my shed with that ball of his? How many times have I told those wretched brats not to play with a football in the front yard? They seem to hear nothing. They are hard of hearing on purpose, if you ask me. I asked Lathan to replace the broken glass, but he still hasn't paid me for the damages. He's 10 years old, for goodness sake. He should know better than that. And those kids he's hanging around with, Carol, they're not a good influence on him. You need to do something about this.
I realised to my abject astonishment that Mr. Harrington believed I was Carol Huberger, and that Lathan was my 10-year-old son, who had obviously been up to all kinds of mischief. He had gone back in his head to another time period in our history, but I tried to use this paradoxical situation to my advantage. You're right, Mr. Harrington. Of course you are. Lathan's been a very bad boy. I need to give him a good talking to. How about you let me take you back home, and I'll get Lathan to refund the damages for your window. I'll tell him never to play near your yard again, or ever run over your foxgloves with his bicycle. Mr. Harrington nodded his approval, and followed me out of the grove back to his home. When I got him into his house, with some masterful persuasion on my part, I have to say, I promptly made him a cup of tea and something to eat, and then he fell fast asleep on the sofa in his lounge, and I discreetly closed the front door behind me and made my way back to Carol's house. The first thing I did when I got into the house was to make myself a coffee to steady my nerves, as this had been an outlandish morning, where I had encountered a Bigfoot and an old man who thought he'd gone back 18 years or so. So there we are. It's getting very, very exciting. We're certainly reaching ahead with this story, and I look forward to you joining me tomorrow night for our final part of the story. Until then, goodbye and good night.